An Aviation Museum Guide by State. Chapter 1. Aviation Museum websites at aerofiles.com/museums.html. aerofiles.com/mil-home.html has historic aviation information. Information about old military planes. Alabama Aviation Museum websites. ussalabama.com/aircraft.php, battleship USS Alabama, mobile. afri.maxwell.af.mil, Maxwell AFB Museum. Southern MUSUMOFflight.org, Southern Museum of Flight, Birmingham. ArmyAviationMuseum.org, U.S. Army Aviation Museum, Fort Rucker. Alaska Aviation Museum websites. AlaskaAirMuseum.org, Alaska Aviation Heritage Museum, Anchorage. akpub.com/akttT/aviat.html, Alaska Land Pioneer Air Museum, Fairbanks. pioneerairmuseum.org/museum-map.html, Pioneer Air Museum, Fairbanks. museumofalaska.org, Museum of Alaska Transport and Industry, Wasilla. Arizona Aviation Museum websites. 390th.org, 390 Bomb Group Memorial Museum, Tucson. LauridsenAviationMuseum.com, Lauridsen Aviation Museum, Glendale. PimaAir.org, Pima Air and Space Museum, Tucson. PlainsOfFame.org, Plains of Fame, Valle. WingsOfFlight.org, Wings of Flight, Mesa. Arkansas Aviation Museum websites. ArkansasAIRoundMilitary.com, Arkansas Air Museum, Fayetteville. AviationCadet.com, Aviation Cadet Museum, Eureka Springs. FortSmithAirMuseum.com, Fort Smith Air Museum. WingsOfHonor.org, Walnut Ridge Army Flying School Museum. California Aviation Museum websites. Aerospace Walk of Honor, Lancaster. Aerospace Museum California.org, Aerospace Museum of CA, McClellan AFB. Airliners.org, Airliners of America, Camarillo. Alameda NavalairMuseum.com, Alameda Naval Air Museum. Aviation Museum of Santa Paula.org, Aviation Museum of Santa Paula. PalmdaleChem.com/blckbird.htm, Blackbird Airpark, Palmdale. GoDixon.com/bam1.htm, Burbank Aviation Museum, Burbank. Orgsites.com/ca/caf-sokal, CAFWW2 Air Museum, Camarillo. California Science-Center.org/ARA-NDSpace/ARA-NDSpace.php, California Science Center, Los Angeles. CastleAirMuseum.org, Castle AFB Museum, Merced. Central CA Historical Military Museum, Dos Palos. ChicoAirMuseum.org, Chico Air Museum. Rotors.org, Classic Rotors Museum, Ramona. ChrisseyFieldAviation.org, Crissey Field Aviation Museum, San Francisco. CityofPalmdale.org/airpark, Joe Davies Heritage Airpark, Palmdale. edwards.af.mil/news/story.asp?ID=123055011, Edwards AFB FTC Museum, Paso Robles. ewarbids.org, Estrella Warbids Museum, Paso Robles. Hiller.org, Hiller Air Museum, San Carlos. HillierAirMuseum.com, Hillier Air Museum, Modesto. Flightpath.us, Lax Flight Path Museum, Los Angeles. Marchfield.org, Marchfield Air Museum, Riverside. Minterfieldairmuseum.com, Minterfield Air Museum, Shafter. Moffatfieldmuseum.org, Moffat Field Historical Society and Museum, Sunnyvale. MuseumOfFlying.com, Museum of Flying, Santa Monica. OaklandAviationMuseum.org, Oakland Aviation Museum, Oakland INTL Airport. P38ASSN.org/museum.htm, P38 Museum, Marchfield. Pacific Coast Air Museum.org, Pacific Coast Air Museum, Santa Rosa/Windsor. Palm Springs Air Museum.org, Palm Springs Air Museum. Plainsoffame.org, Plains of Fame, Chino. San Diego AIRANSpace.org, San Diego Air and Space Museum. San Diego Flight Museum. SMMOF.org, Santa Maria Museum of Flight. Yelp.com/biz/vernon-p-saxon-aerospace-museum-boron, Saxon Aerospace Museum, Boron. twinbeach.com/stockton_field_page.htm, Stockton Field Aviation Museum. travisairmuseum.org, Travis Air Museum, Fairfield. edwards.af.mil/museum, U.S. Air Force Flight Test Center Museum, Edwards AFB. flyingleathernecks.org, USMC Flying Leatherneck Museum, MCAS Miramar. ChinaLakeMuseum.org, USN Museum of Armament and Technology, China Lake. USS-HORNET.org, USS Hornet Museum, Alameda. Midway.org, USS Midway Museum, San Diego. WWAM.org, Warbids West Air Museum, El Cajon. WMOF.com, Western Museum of Flight, Torrance. Wingsandrotors.org, Wings and Rotors Museum, Murrieta. Wingsofhistory.org, Wings of History, San Martin. Yanksair.com, Yanks Air Museum, Chino. Colorado Aviation Museum websites. PeteMuseum.org, Peterson Air and Space Museum, Colorado Springs. SpiritOfFlight.com, Spirit of Flight Center, Lafayette. PWAM.org, Weisbrod Aircraft Museum, Pueblo. WingsMuseum.org, Wings Over the Rockies, Denver, Lowry Field. LafayetteFoundation.org, Vintage Aero Flying Museum, FT Lupton. Connecticut Aviation Museum websites. nationalhelicoptermuseum.org/exhibits.html, National Helicopter Museum, Stratford. NEAM.org, New England Air Museum, Windsor Locks. prop-liners.com, Propliners of America, Stafford Springs. Delaware Aviation Museum websites. amcmuseum.org, Air Mobility Command Museum, Dover AFB. District of Columbia Aviation Museum websites. nasm.si.edu, National Air and Space Museum. postalmuseum.si.edu/index.html, National Postal Museum. Florida Aviation Museum websites. DeLand-NAVALairMuseum.org, DeLand NAS Museum. sun-fun.org/museum.aspx, Florida Air Museum, Lakeland. afarmamentmuseum.com/index.shtml, Hurlburt AFB Museum, Mary Esther. KennedySpaceCenter.com, Kennedy Space Center, Cape Canaveral. KissimiAirMuseum.com, Kissimmee Air Museum. NAS Whiting Field Museum. NavalAviationMuseum.org, National Museum of Naval Aviation, NAS Pensacola. afarmamentmuseum.com, U.S. Air Force Armament Museum, Eglin AFB. VacWarbids.org, Valiant Air CMD Museum, Titusville. WingsOverMiami.com, Wings Over Miami. Georgia Aviation Museum websites. ArmyAV.org, Army Aviation Heritage Foundation, Hampton. DeltaMuseum.org, Delta Air Transport Heritage Museum, Atlanta. Mighty8th.org, Mighty 8th Air Force Museum, Savannah. MuseumOfAviation.org, Museum of Aviation, Warner Robins. ThomasvilleAviationMuseum.org, Power of the Past Museum, Thomasville. Hawaii Aviation Museum websites. NamBarbersPoint.org, Nam Barbers Point, Kapolei, Oahu. PacificAsixationMuseum.org, Pacific Aviation Museum, Ford Island, Honolulu. Idaho Aviation Museum websites. Aeroplanes over Idaho, Caldwell. BirdAviationMuseum.com, Bird Aviation Museum, Sandpoint. museum.mil.idaho.gov/whats_new.html, Idaho Military History Museum, Boise. LegacyFlightMuseum.com, Legacy Flight Museum, Rexburg. WarhawkAirMuseum.org, Warhawk Museum, Nampa. Illinois Aviation Museum websites. AirClassicsMuseum.org, Air Classics Museum, Sugar Grove. AirCombatMuseum.org, Air Combat Museum, Springfield. Aeromuseum.org, Octave, Chanute Air Museum, Rantoul. AERA&DSpaceMuseum.org, Greater St. Louis Air and Space Museum, Cahokia. NASGlenviewMuseum.org/newlayoutindex.asp, NAS Glenview Museum. HeritageInFlight.org, Heritage in Flight Museum, Lincoln. MSIChicago.org, Museum of Science and Industry, Chicago. O'Hare.com/O'Hare/about_exhibit2.shtm, Butch, O'Hare Memorial, Chicago Ord. PrairieAviationMuseum.org, Prairie Aviation Museum, Bloomington. WarbirdHeritageFoundation.org, Warbird Heritage Museum, Waukegan. JET-WARBIRDS.com, World Aerospace Museum, Quincy. Indiana Aviation Museum websites. AMHEF.org, American Military Heritage Museum, Indianapolis. BellAircraft Museum.org/?Q=node/12, Lawrence, Bell Aircraft Museum, Mentone. FWAirport.com/Fort-Wayne-International/Aviation-Museum, Fort Wayne Aviation Museum. GrissamAirMuseum.com, Gus, Grissom Air Park and Museum, Kokomo. HoosierAirMuseum.org, Hoosier Air Museum, Auburn. IndyMilitary.com/collection-exhibits/featured-exhibits, Indiana Military Museum, Vincennes. ModelAircraft.org/museum.aspx, National Model Aviation Museum, Muncie. Iowa Aviation Museum websites. AntiqueAirfield.com, AAA Air Power Museum, Ottumwa. FlyingMuseum.com, Iowa Aviation Museum, Greenfield. Iowa Aviation Heritage Museum.webs.com, Iowa Aviation Heritage Museum, Ankeny. MidAmericaAirMuseum.org, Mid-America Air Museum, Sioux City. Kansas Aviation Museum websites. AugustaAirMuseum.com, Augusta Air Museum, Augusta. CombatAirMuseum.org, Combat Air Museum, Topeka. KansasAviationMuseum.org, Kansas Aviation Museum, Wichita. KansasTravel.org/airmuseum.hdm, Mid-America Air Museum, Liberal. Reflections of Freedom Air Park, McConnell AFB. Kentucky Aviation Museum websites. AviationKY.org, Aviation Museum of Kentucky, Lexington. ThelosTSquadron.com, The Lost Squadron, Middlesboro. FortCampbell.com/museum/Don-F-Pratt-Museum, Don F. Pratt Memorial Museum, F.T. Campbell. Louisiana Aviation Museum websites. BarksdaleGlobalPowerMuseum.com, 8th Air Force Museum, Barksdale AFB. ChenaltMuseum.org, Aviation and Military Museum of Louisiana, Monroe. lsm.crt.state.la.us/wedelex.htm, Weddell Williams Aviation Museum, Patterson. Maine Aviation Museum websites. MaineAirMuseum.com/page/942/home, Maine Air Museum, Bangor. OTEM.org, Owl's Head Transportation Museum, Owl's Head. Maryland Aviation Museum websites. CollegeParkAviationMuseum.com, College Park Aviation Museum. Hagerstown Aviation Museum.org, Hagerstown Aviation Museum. MDairMuseum.org, Maryland Aviation Museum, Middle River. Masiero.org, Massey Air Museum. PaxMuseum.com, Pax River Naval Air Museum, Patuxent River. usna.edu/museum, US Naval Academy Museum, Annapolis. Forestal.info/index.hdm, USS Forestal Museum. Massachusetts Aviation Museum websites. collingsfoundation.org/menu.hdm, Collings Foundation, STO. centercomp.com/dc3/9617.html, New England Escadrille, Bedford. Michigan Aviation Museum websites. airzoo.org, Airzoo, Kalamazoo. TheFightingFalcon.com, Fighting Falcon Museum, Greenville. TheHenry Ford.org/exhibits/heroes/home.asp, Henry J. Ford Museum, Dearborn. KishaMuseum.org, Sawyer Heritage Air Museum. SelfridgeAirMuseum.org, Selfridge Military Air Museum. YankeeAirMuseum.org, Yankee Air Museum, Belleville. Minnesota Aviation Museum websites. AmericanWings.org, American Wings Air Museum, Blaine. NWAHistory.org, Northwest Airlines History CTR, Bloomington. MNangMuseum.org, Minnesota Air Guard Museum, St. Paul. min.net/farles/mahasi, Minnesota Aviation History and Education Center, St. Paul. Waten.org, Wings of the North, Eden Prairie. Mississippi Aviation Museum websites. mdac.state.ms.us/ag-museum/national-agriculture-aviation-museum.hdm, National Agricultural Aviation Museum, Jackson. Missouri Aviation Museum websites. airlinehistory.org, Airline History Museum, Kansas City. ammomuseum.com/index.hdm, Air and Military Museum of the Ozarks, Springfield. Historic Aircraft Restoration Museum.org, Historic Aircraft Restoration Museum, St. Louis. St. Louis Aviation Museum, see Cahokia IL site. Montana Aviation Museum websites. malmstrom.af.mil/library/malmstrom-museum/index.asp, Malmstrom AFB Museum, Great Falls. Nebraska Aviation Museum websites. strategicairoundspace.com, Strategic Air and Space Museum, Ashland. Nevada Aviation Museum websites. Howard W. Cannon Aviation Museum, Las Vegas. New Hampshire Aviation Museum websites. NHAS.org, New Hampshire Aviation Historical Society, Concord. New Jersey Aviation Museum websites. AirVictoryMuseum.org, Air Victory Museum, Lumberton. NewJerseyAHoff.org, Aviation Hall of Fame of New Jersey, Teterboro. SpiritOFFreedom.org, Berlin Airlift Historical Foundation, Farmingdale. P47MILLVILLE.org, Millville AAF Museum. NLHS.com, NAS Lakehurst Historical Society, Lakehurst. USNASW.org, NAS Wildwood Museum, Cape May. New Mexico Aviation Museum websites. WAR-EAGLES-AIR-MUSEUM.com, War Eagles Air Museum, Santa Teresa. New York Aviation Museum websites. 1941HAG.org, 1941 Historic Aircraft Group, Geneseo. Americana IR-PowerMuseum.com, American Air Power Museum, Farmingdale. BayportAerodrome.org, Bayport Aerodrome. CradleOfAviation.org, Cradle of Aviation Museum, Garden City. Glenn H. Curtis Museum.org, Glenn H. Curtis Museum, Hammondsport. ESAM.org, Empire State Aerosciences Museum, Scotia. GeneseeWarbuds.com, Genesee Warbuds AVN History Museum, Batavia. IntrepidMuseum.org, Intrepid Sea Airspace Museum, NYC. HPSMITHPOST24.org/monument.aspx, Mohawk Valley B-52 Memorial, Rome. SoaringMuseum.org, National Soaring Museum, Elmira. NiagaraMuseum.org, Niagara Aerospace Museum, Niagara Falls. OldRhinebeck.org, Old Rhinebeck Aerodrome, Rhinebeck. VintageAircraftGroup.org, Vintage Aircraft Group, Albion. WingsOfEagles.com, Wings of Eagles, Big Flats. North Carolina Aviation Museum websites. ASOMF.org, Airborne and Special Operations Museum, Farmingdale. CarolinesAviation.org, Carolinas Aviation Museum, Charlotte. co.dare.nc.us/airport/museum.asp, Dare County Airport Museum, Manteo. HickoryAviationMuseum.org, Hickory Aviation Museum. NC Aviation Museum halloffame.com/index.html, North Carolina Aviation Museum, Asheboro. WNCareMuseum.com, Western North Carolina Air Museum, Hendersonville. nps.gov/wrbr/index.htm, Wright Brothers National Memorial, Kitty Hawk. North Dakota Aviation Museum websites. Dakota Museum.com, Dakota Territory Air Museum, Minot. FargoAirMuseum.org, Fargo Air Museum. Ohio Aviation Museum websites. ArmstrongMuseum.org, Neil Armstrong Airspace Museum, Wapakoneta. ChampaignAviationMuseum.org, Champaign Aviation Museum, Urbana. WRHS.org/research/Crawford, Crawford Auto Aviation Museum, Cleveland. Firelands Military Museum, Norwalk. HistoricalAircraftSquadron.com, Historical Aircraft Squadron, Carroll. EWASM.org, International Women's Air and Space Museum, Cleveland. MapsAirMuseum.org, Maps Air Museum, Canton. NationalAviation.org, National Aviation Hall of Fame, Wright-Patterson AFB. NationalMuseum.af.mil, National Museum of U.S. Air Force, Wright-Patterson AFB. TRI-STATEWARBIRDMUSEUM.org, Tri-State Warbird Museum, Batavia. WacoAirMuseum.org, Waco Aircraft Museum, Troy. WRIGHT-B-FLYER.org, Wright B Flyer Museum, Dayton. Oklahoma Aviation Museum websites. Heartland Air Museum, Bristow. ScienceMusumoc.org/content/aviation, Kirkpatrick Science and Airspace Museum, Oklahoma City. NINETY-NINES.org/index.cfm/99s_of_women_pilots.htm, Museum of Women Pilots, Oklahoma City. OklahomaMuseumOfFlying.org, Oklahoma Museum of Flying, Bethany. StaffordSpaceCenter.com, Stafford Air and Space Center, Weatherford. Tulsa AIROundSpaceMuseum.com, Tulsa Air and Space Museum. Oregon Aviation Museum websites. ClassicaAircraft.org, Classic Aircraft Museum, Hillsboro. SpruceGoose.org, Evergreen Air Museum, McMinnville. northernairgon.com/profiles/orspace.html, Oregon Air and Space Museum, Eugene. Pendleton Air Museum. Tillamook.com, Tillamook Air Museum. WataaMuseum.org, Western Antique Aeroplane/Auto Museum, Hood River. Pennsylvania Aviation Museum websites. AirHeritage.org, Air Heritage Inc., Beaver Falls. HelicopterMuseum.org, American Helicopter Museum, W. Chester. fi.edu/exhibit/Franklin-Air-Show, Franklin Institute Science Museum, Philadelphia. GoldenAgeAir.org, Golden Age Air Museum, Bethel Pa. MAM.org, Mid-Atlantic Air Museum, Reading. PiperMuseum.com, Piper Aviation Museum, Lock Haven. DVHA.org, Pitcairn Wings of Freedom, Willow Grove. Rhode Island Aviation Museum websites. QuonsitAirMuseum.com, Quonset Air Museum, and Kingstown, South Carolina Aviation Museum websites. PatriotsPoint.org, Patriots Point Naval and Maritime Museum, South Dakota Aviation Museum websites. SDAIRunSpaceMuseum.com, South Dakota Air and Space Museum Box Elder, Tennessee Aviation Museum websites. BeechcraftHeritageMuseum.org, Beechcraft Heritage Museum, Tullahoma. SwiftMuseumFoundation.org, Swift Museum, Athens. TeenAirMuseum.com, Tennessee Museum of Aviation, Sevierville. Texas Aviation Museum websites. 1940AIRTERMINAL.org, 1940 Air Terminal Museum, Houston. CRSmithMuseum.org, American Airlines, C.R. Smith Museum, F.T. Worth. AirPowerMuseum.org, American Air Power Heritage Museum, Midland. BreckenridgeTexas.com/attractions/aviationmuse.html, Breckenridge Aviation Museum closed. BFTSmuseum.org/home.php, British Flying Training School Museum, Terrell. BrookesHeritage.org/generalinformation.htm, Brooks Heritage Foundation, Brooks City Base. CavanaughFlightMuseum.com, Cavanaugh Flight Museum, Dallas. CWAM.org, Cold War Air Museum, Lancaster. ccmuseum.com/explore/museum, Corpus Christi Museum of Science and Industry. dias.af.mil/libraries/factsheets/ID???18236, dias-AFB Linear Air Park, Abilene. TexasAviationMuseum.org, English Field Air and Space Museum, Amarillo. FlightOfThePhoenix.org, Flight of the Phoenix Museum, Gilmer. FlightMuseum.com, Frontiers of Flight Museum, Dallas. HANGAR10.org, Hangar 10 Flying Museum, Denton. Facebook.com/pages/hangar-25-museum/16908018929, Hangar 25 Air Museum, Big Spring. TylerHam.com, Historic Aviation Memorial Museum, Tyler. Lackland.af.mil/info/planes, Lackland AFB, San Antonio. LSFM.org, Lone Star Flight Museum, Galveston. National Museum of the Pacific War.org, National Museum of the Pacific War, Fredericksburg. PioneerFlightMuseum.org, Pioneer Flight Museum, Kingsbury. SilentWingsMuseum.com, Silent Wings Museum, Lubbock. TexasAirMuseum.org, Texas Air Museum, San Antonio. USSLexington.com, USS Lexington Museum, Corpus Christi. VintageFlyingMuseum.org, Vintage Flying Museum, Fort Worth. Utah Aviation Museum websites. hill.af.mil/library/museum/index.asp, Hill AFB Museum, Ogden. WendoverAirbase.com, Historic Wendover Airfield, Wendover. Virginia Aviation Museum websites. araNDSpace.si.edu/visit/udvar-hazy-center, NASM Udvar-Hazy, Chantilly. MilitaryAviationMuseum.org, Military Aviation Museum, Virginia Beach. VASC.org, Virginia Air and Space Center, Hampton. vam.smv.org, Virginia Aviation Museum, Richmond. usmcmuseum.org, USMC National Museum, Triangle. Washington Aviation Museum websites. ARMEDFORCES-AEROSPACEMUS.org, Armed Forces and Aerospace Museum, Spokane. FlyingHeritage.com, Flying Heritage Collection, Everett. FutureOfFlight.org, Future of Flight Aviation Center, Mukilteo. HeritageFlight.org, Heritage Flight Museum, Everett. HistoricFlight.org/contact.html, Historic Flight, Everett. Honorpoint.org, Honor Point Military and Aerospace Museum, Spokane. Museumofflight.org, Museum of Flight, Seattle. McCordAirMuseum.org, McCord Air Museum, Tacoma. PBEMF.org, NAS Whidbey Island Museum. OlympicFlightMuseum.com, Olympic Flight Museum, Olympia. PTAeromuseum.com, Port Townsend Aero Museum, Port Townsend. nps.gov/fova/historyculture/pearson.htm, Pearson Air Museum, Vancouver. Wisconsin Aviation Museum websites. bvhcenter.org, Richard I, Bong Heritage Center, Superior. awcw.org/about.php, Aviation Heritage Center of Wisconsin, Sheboygan. airventuremuseum.org, EAA Air Adventure Museum, Oshkosh. mitchellgallery.org, Mitchell Gallery of Flight, Milwaukee. folkfield.ang.af.mil/museum.htm, Folkfield Library and Museum. Wyoming Aviation Museum websites. calairmuseum.org/home.html, Call Air Museum, Afton.